Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Spigel. I'm a geologist at the Maine Geological Survey. Thanks for joining me today to learn a little bit about landslides in Maine. So just an overview here. Today I'm going to provide a brief history of well-known historic and modern landslides in Maine, factors that cause landslides in Maine, the most common types of landslides that occur in Maine, a new type of topographic data called LiDAR that has revealed hundreds of previously unknown landslides in Maine, and some landslide risk factors in Maine. I'll wrap up the presentation with a list of additional information sources and field guides for visiting some publicly accessible landslides in Maine, and hopefully we'll have time for me to show you some examples of those. The first Maine landslide to be documented in written history occurred along the Kennebunk River in 1670 near an area known as Durrell's Bridge. In 1831, geologist Edward Hitchcock sketched the aftermath of a landslide along the Presumpscot River near what is now the Route 302 bridge in Westbrook, and that's that illustration right here. Geologist Edward Morse published a lengthy account of an 1849 landslide along the Stroudwater River in Westbrook. The right photo over here is a modern view into the landslide from the Stroudwater River Trail. Now I've got my pointer working there. Whoops. Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulties here. All right. The largest landslide documented in Maine occurred in 1868 along the Presumpscot River in Westbrook. This event blocked the river and flooded Cumberland Mills, forcing workers to dig the river a new path through the debris. This photo from the Westbrook Historical Society is looking up into the landslide from near the river. Fast forward to recent times, and many of you may remember some of these events. In 1983, vibrations or a sudden change in the water table during water well drilling for a new house along the Stroudwater River in Gorham resulted in a damaging landslide. A few trucks and vans took a ride there, but nobody was hurt. In 1996, the 1996 Rockland Harbor landslide was an impressive event, but not the first or last in this harbor. Another landslide occurred just around the corner from here in 1973, and some small slumps have continued since then. This was a pretty well publicized event on the news, and a couple of homes were destroyed, but again, nobody was hurt, thankfully. If you're from Wells or have walked the Loop Trail in the Rachel Carson Preserve, you probably know of a 2005 landslide that occurred along the Maryland River. Another slump occurred along the trail in spring of 2019, and we'll come back to this event later in the presentation. While much property has been damaged and destroyed by Maine landslides, as I mentioned earlier, we are very lucky that no one has been seriously injured. So let's get into some of the nuts and bolts here. Mass wasting is a general term that describes any downslope movement of earth materials due to gravity, and landslides are a type of mass wasting. In turn, there are several different types of landslides, and their definitions can vary worldwide. A single landslide can also have the features of more than one type, which can make things even more confusing. We're going to keep it simple today and learn some basic landslide terminology, along with some common types and examples from Maine. Here we have my best attempt at a side view cartoon sketch of a landslide. I'm not an artist, so I don't make any claims here. The most upslope extent of a landslide, let me get my pointer out here. So this area, the most upslope extent of a landslide is an often steep slope called a scarp. The chunks of earth materials, seen as these ridges here, are the earth materials that moved during the landslide, and these are called slide blocks. The most downslope extent of a landslide is called the toe, which is often a jumbled mess of debris. So I've got some trees and boulders and whatnot mixed in there. The surface on which the sliding occurred is called the shear plane. So that's this dark line right here. And the depression created by the landslide is the crater. So those are some basic terms that I'll mention later on, again, as I describe the different types of landslides. The most common type of landslide in Maine is the rotational slide and slump. So for each landslide type example, there will be a before and after cartoon illustration at the top, and some photo examples below with arrows connecting the different parts of the landslide that you can see in the photos. In a rotational landslide, the slide blocks move down and out on a curved shear plane, which tends to pitch trees on the slide blocks back upslope. The 2006 Greenbush landslide that happened along the Penobscot River and Route 2 is a great example, and this picture clearly shows how a slide block moved down and out on a curved shear plane, pitching back the trees that took a ride on a slide block. The 2005 Wells landslide is another good example, and here we can see where the trees are pitching back on the slide block below. Oh no, my phone's ringing. Hold on a second. I'm sorry about that. The hazards of a home presentation, huh? Okay. Translational landslides. These tend to occur in mountainous areas where thin soils slide as one unit over bedrock. The 1990 Mount Hitty landslide is a great example, and it can still be viewed from Route 26 in Newry on your way to Grafton Notch State Park. There's actually a nice pullout on the side of the road where you can get a view of the slide. Flow slides occur when water-saturated materials move downslope as a slurry. So flows require wet conditions and often have no structure or slide blocks, as we can see here and in the photo below. This photo shows a flow in Chelsea that was active over several years in the 1970s until it was stabilized. So we can see that there are no slide blocks. It's just a slurry of earth materials and water that had moved downslope. Spreads are a really interesting type of landslide that require a soft geological layer beneath the surface, which is the blue layer in this illustration. When disturbed, this soft layer deforms and flows, while stronger materials at the surface break into slide blocks and take a ride. This is the brown layer in the illustration, and it makes up the slide blocks in the after cartoon. A peculiar spread landslide occurred in 1989 at a Norridge Walk, Maine landfill when a slope became unstable and blocks of garbage broke apart into slide blocks, sliding across the soft clay below. So we can see on this side view photo, very clear slide blocks that moved on clay below that we can't see in the photo. Lastly, there are rockfalls, which are not technically landslides. They are a type of mass wasting, but they are common in mountainous areas of Maine, and they can mobilize materials downslope that then become a landslide. Fresh rockfalls often appear as stripes on mountainsides, and a 2018 event on Bald Mountain in Newry is a great example here. The Grafton Loop Trail crosses over this area, and while you don't summit Bald Mountain, you can get an idea for the topography if you've ever hiked that trail. So those are all of the types that we might see in Maine. So let's talk about some of the factors that could cause landslides in Maine. So there are 4 main factors that lead to landslides in Maine, and the first is pretty straightforward. When a slope is steepened, it's less stable. Natural processes such as riverbank erosion or coastal bluff erosion are the usual culprits in Maine, and they're difficult to control without creating other problems over time. The photo on the left shows an exposed and potentially unstable stream bank area, which would be this area here if we were looking at a stream from above. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. The photo on the right shows an exposed coastal bluff area in Brunswick, and the illustration below shows how wave action can undermine bluff areas, leading to landslides over time. Sea level rise has the potential to intensify this process, and if you live in the coastal area, you've probably heard about this problem in the past. So here's, this is a photo of the 2019 slump along the Maryland River at the Rachel Carson Preserve. This used to be Stop 9, I believe. But this is a great example of what rivers do as they move around over time. This area is located on the outside of a river bend, as we can see in the photo. And this area is known as a cut bank. And this is where bank erosion is most common, especially during spring floods. The observation platform also added weight to the slope, which may have decreased the stability of the area. And of course, this has all been since removed and rerouted. So this isn't what you'll see if you go there now, but the staff was kind enough to send me a picture right after it happens. So humans can also lead to unstable slopes, and road cuts are a great example of that. This is a view from the Penobscot Narrow Bridges of a very large road cut there. This is from the observation tower. And if you look closely on your next visit as you go around this corner, you'll see that the blasted rock face is held in place with mesh and bolts to prevent rock falls. And they're constantly monitoring the rock in this area to prevent damage. Water is also an incredibly significant landslide factor. Water enters a slope through spring snowmelt and rain, and this adds a lot of weight to the slope. A little bit of water can help hold loose earth materials together. Think of when you build a sandcastle at the beach. But too much water reduces friction between the sand grains and the castle collapses. Many of the landslide examples I mentioned earlier occurred during the spring, and this is no coincidence. Wet conditions were a factor in all of these events. Humans can also destabilize slopes with water added through things like irrigation, drains, and septic leach fields. Landslides can occur in many of Maine's geologic units, but are by far most common in a marine mud known as the Presumpscot Formation that was deposited in southern Maine at the end of the last ice age. The Presumpscot Formation is what engineers call a sensitive clay. This means that it can deform and flow when disturbed or left unsupported, leading to landslides. It's the clay that I mentioned earlier in the garbage spread landslide example. Here we have a photo of an excavation into Presumpscot Formation in Gardner, Maine. When exposed to water and air, it weathers into a hard tan crust, which we can see here at the top. Perhaps you are lucky enough to have encountered this concrete-like layer in your own yard. Below the surface, however, the Presumpscot Formation is blue-gray and can be incredibly soft, like Play-Doh or silly putty. So here's an exposure of soft Presumpscot Formation in the toe of the 2005 Wells landslide, and then a wad of gooey Presumpscot that was removed from the 2006 Greenbush landslide site during remediation. Hopefully this gives you an idea of just how pliable this material is. And lastly, another couple of factors are extreme events, such as severe storms, that can cause both slope saturation and erosion, and earthquakes. So here we have an example of a slump that occurred in Brunswick after the Patriots Day storm. So there was probably a lot of water added to the slope, as well as erosion at the base of the slope due to wave action, which led to the slump. And then here's a photo from a rock fall triggered by a swarm of earthquakes in 2006 on Mount Desert Island. Earthquakes in Maine during historic and modern times have not really been much strong enough to trigger anything more than rock falls and very small landslides. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened in the past or couldn't happen in the future. Okay, let's talk about LiDAR. In the early 2000s, Maine began to collect a new type of topographic data called LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging. LiDAR is essentially a high-resolution laser scan of the Earth's surface by plane, and the data can be processed to remove buildings and trees, resulting in bare Earth topography. LiDAR data has many uses, but it allows geologists to see detailed features that were formerly hidden by heavy tree cover. For example, up here on this map, this is the typical information a geologist would have in the pre-LiDAR era: an air photo, and topographic contours, which are the brown lines, that are usually at 10 to 20 foot intervals. So this map shows a portion of the Swan Pond Brook Valley in Biddeford, and it looks like a typical forested valley, nothing really special about it. But if we look at LiDAR for the same exact area, it reveals that the valley is actually full of landslides, which are outlined in red. They can be identified by their steep scarp areas, and we'll see more examples of these later, but this is a scarp right here where my pointer is. And the slide block ridges, which we can see a little bit in some of these areas, and we'll look at more examples here in a second. But those were all hiding in plain sight, basically. So let's look at some other LiDAR examples. This is Maine's largest landslide that we've delineated from LiDAR. It's about 1 square mile, and this is in Hollis. This is the Saco River here. Over here off the photo would be the location of Bonnie Eagle High School. And this is the Killick Pond Wildlife Management area, if you're familiar with the area. We can see the steep scarp of this landslide in many areas. The landslide is probably what blocked this stream and created Killick Pond itself. We can see a lot of the slide block ridges. And the toe is over here. And the toe also probably went out this way into the Saco River and has long since been eroded and carried away by the river itself. Here are several landslides along the Saco River at Steep Falls. This line right here is Route 11. This is the Saco River. This would be the bridge area where the Steep Falls are located. We can see some of the steep scarps right here. And the slide block ridges. These are all great examples of spread landslide types. Here's another one down here. So this landslide moved this way. We can see there's an old channel of the Saco River, and this landslide probably blocked the river, forcing it into its current path to the west. Here's another set of landslides along the Mousom River in Kennebunk. This is Route 99 right here, and this is the Kennebunk Sand Plain area if you visited that. So here are some steep scarp areas that we can see for these various landslides along with the slide block ridges. And the Malsum River has eroded down through much of these landslides in the thousands of years since they have occurred. And lastly, here's a very large landslide that's just south of Sebago Lake in Standish. And you can go visit this landslide. It's part of the Sebago Lake Land Reserve. This is route, this is Route 35 right here. And this is the rail trail area that goes through here that you can access in the Otter Pond area. So here we can see the steep scarp and the ridges of the slide blocks. And then the toe of the landslide extends all the way down here. And the landslide deposit itself has been eroded over the years by these smaller streams. So, we use LiDAR to identify landslides in Maine's inland areas, which lacked an official inventory that had already been completed many years ago for coastal areas. This map shows Maine inland landslide locations, so those that are not directly on the coast. And they're all indicated by the red dots on the map. And these are shown also in relation to geology and town population. There are almost 300 landslides, and most of these, as we can see, have occurred in the most populated area of the state, which is shown by the yellow and orange colors on the map. And they're also likely related to the Presumpscot Formation, which can occur anywhere south of this blue line that is on the map. So we know that we could have Presumpscot anywhere south towards the ocean of this blue line right here. So, we had no idea when these newly discovered landslides occurred. Were they thousands of years old, hundreds of years old? Why did they happen? Could they happen again? We decided to determine the ages of a few of these landslides to start answering these questions. But how to do that? Let's picture a forested slope in side view, which I have a cartoon illustration of here on the slide. Then let's say a landslide occurs, destroying the downslope area, burying trees in the toe debris, and burying the former valley floor soil, which is shown as this brown line right here. These buried trees and plant fragments in the soil are the key. They can be sampled, and we can use radiocarbon dating to estimate when they were killed by the landslide, and in turn, the landslide age. So here's an example of trees buried in the toe of an ancient landslide along Portland's western promenade that were uncovered by a 2007 construction project. And we can see them sticking out in this gray-blue material. Here is Presumpscot Formation clay. So these trees died about 13,500 years ago. And so we know that the landslide occurred around that time. Here are some photos of a landslide in Arundel, where we augured through the toe, which we're doing here. We do everything by hand. And we found a beautiful buried soil, which we can see in these two photos right here. So this is the soil, and that would be about this area in the cartoon illustration. And this is the Presumpscot Formation clay that buried that soil during the landslide. So if we look close at this photo, you can see that the plant fragments look amazingly fresh, as if the landslide had happened just yesterday. The clay does a really good job of preserving these soils. So we were able to find out that this landslide was about 600 years old. So in all, so far, we've studied about 30 landslides in southern Maine and found that they are not all thousands and thousands of years old. They range in age. and many were only hundreds of years old, like this landslide in Arundel. Several landslides, in fact, occurred around 600 years ago, and we're still trying to determine what this means. Was the climate incredibly wet then? Was there a strong earthquake? There's still a lot of work to do to figure out the answers to these questions. So, to wrap things up, here are a few key points about landslide risk in Maine and some of the points that I mentioned earlier. So, where are landslides most likely to occur in Maine? River corridors and coastal bluffs, especially where the Presumpscot Formation is present, but also in steep mountainous areas, such as in western Maine. So when are landslides most likely? When should we be on high alert for these events? Definitely in spring and early summer, especially if we've had a lot of snow in the previous winter, combined with a lot of spring rain, especially if there's been several years in a row with wet conditions. But also after intense summer thunderstorms, hurricanes, nor'easters, things like that. So what are some warning signs of landslides? Well, there's not a lot. Unfortunately, these tend to happen rather quickly, but sometimes you can see active slope erosion or slumping ahead of time, and sometimes you can see tension cracks at the top of the slope, which we can see here in these two examples. And sometimes you might see foundation cracks are settling in nearby structures, and that here's some cracks in the foundation of this house here. So what can be done to prevent landslide damage? Well, the obvious answer is to limit development in river corridors and coastal bluff areas, but a lot of that has taken place already in Maine. So in order to work with that area, we have to monitor the slopes, especially in spring. And then if there's new development, it's really important to investigate and accommodate the geology. So this photo here is of a construction site where they're actually removing Presumpscot Formation before they proceed with the building. And there's other ways to deal with it as well, but you can see how soft it is here. They were just scraping it up with an excavator. All right, so I have a lot of links, and hopefully you can come back to the recording and look at these, or we can figure out a way to convey these links to you guys if you're interested in checking them out. But let me share my screen for Google with you, and then I can show you some examples. Let me turn off my pointer here. New share. All right, hopefully you can all see Google now. If you go to the Maine Geological Survey website, you can see a lot of links here on the right. And one of those is our Landslides webpage. So go there really quick. And we have a lot of great links. So the Maine Landslide Guide is more in depth than what I've covered today. And we also have what we call fact and locality sheets. And these are areas where you can go read more about landslides or even take a tour. So Quarry Woods in Freeport has a landslide that you can visit in person. And I mentioned also the Sebago Lake Land Reserve, where you can visit a landslide in person as well. We also have a web map. It's this link right here. And you can view all of our data for free. So we have a menu over here. Hopefully it's going to cooperate. My bandwidth is not that great. If you scroll down, we've got Maine inland landslides, and so those are the points from the map that I showed you earlier. We also have coastal landslides, which you can turn on. Oh, it's slowing down. And you can also turn on things like the LiDAR. My connection may be too slow to show you, but you can overlay all of these on each other and you can look and see if you have a landslide near you. Oh, there it goes. So we can zoom in here and see, this is west of Portland here. It'll just take a second to resolve. It's a little slow. Okay, we'll come back to that. Last thing I wanted to show you all was a video of a landslide that just happened in Norway a couple of weeks ago. So they also have sensitive clay in Norway, similar to the Brezumskot Formation in Maine. And so if we had a landslide, it could look something like this. So let's see if this will work. So you can see this is a spread landslide. And it's actually moving as one giant slide block. And it's pretty amazing. The trees aren't even moving. They're just riding along on the soft clay below. And it's important to note that nobody was hurt during this landslide, which is pretty amazing. These were all vacation homes that were unoccupied at the time. All right, so that seems like enough destruction there. Maybe we can have a chat here and do any questions.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Let's see. I know that there was a question in the very beginning. Okay, David Thompson. He said, if time, more on translational slides, please. Waterbury Stowe, Vermont had one at Cotton Brook 2 years ago. What are some vectors?
I guess I need clarification on what he means by vectors.
David, if you want to unmute yourself or type something in the chat, whichever you prefer.
Sure, there you go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Because it has that triangle shape to it there, it's almost as if it has a single point source to it there, and that's intriguing because that's exactly what Cotton Brook had. And and then the Cotton Brook slide, it's there was a mountain bike trail that zigzagged right at it, and it's also was in a bit of an incline. And when I inquired if that was a possibility with the state geologist, they muted me from all further conversations there. Yeah, because what was supposed, it actually wasn't supposed to be a mountain bike trail, it was supposed to be a hiking trail only, but they used it for mountain biking, and I wondered if mountain bikes were kind of making the cut back into a U, and if it was just catching water, and if that undermined onto a clay surface, which it was. But I was wondering in nature, because that was the Mount Hitty in Grafton.
Hitty, yes.
Yeah, and I was wondering what caused the Mount Hitty translational.
So
Thank you.
yeah, sure. So the triangular shape of the Mount Hitty landslide is probably due to the fact that, like I mentioned with rock falls, it probably started as a rock fall and those rocks tumbled down slope, and then that activity dislodged material below. And if I remember correctly from our department notes, it had been pretty wet. So the slope was probably saturated, it's thin soil trails. So the trigger we could think of as being the rockfall itself. As far as the hiking trails and the mountain biking in Vermont, I'm not sure. You know, sometimes, yeah, things like trails and logging roads can become nick points and pathways for water that can lead to some instability. But I couldn't say for sure because I'm not really familiar with the area. So I'm sorry, but it's not impossible, but it's probably more likely that it was just generally wet combined with the geology. Okay, so let's look at some other questions here. Oh, yep. So we just talked about how the water being rerouted depending on the topography. So we kind of covered that one already. So another question, are the majority of the identified landslides centered around that volcanic bedrock? So no, as I mentioned before, they're actually, most of Maine landslides are related to the Presumpscot Formation. That's really probably the most dangerous geology that we have. And we oftentimes can't even see it. It's below the surface. So it's kind of interesting. Not to say that we don't have landslides that are related to bedrock, but the Presumpscot Formation is most important. Okay, let's see another question here. With climate predictions pointing to a wetter northeast in our future, what's Maine doing to prepare and educate home and business owners about landslide risk? And is there landslide insurance? We have a member who lost her house to the Maryland River slide. Yes, so that's definitely a problem. I don't think that there is landslide insurance. It'd be one of those things where it's considered an act of nature. We do have flood insurance, of course, that you can get through the government, but that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure about that one. I'm sorry. So we've been in contact with the Maine Emergency Management Agency. And they know that landslides are a risk in Maine, and they're aware of that. And so that's their job, is to disseminate that information to your local county and town emergency management agencies. But yeah, we can see that when we have periods of wetter climate, so in the early 2000s, so period of time from about 2005 to 2009, it was generally wetter. And so there were a rash of these small landslides. But over the past few years, we've had really dry summers and not a lot of snowfall in a lot of areas. So we haven't seen a lot of landslides. So it's really going to depend on what those climate predictions actually mean. If we get a lot of rain in the summer, that may not affect landslides as much as if we were to get a lot of snow in the winter and then a lot of spring rain. So the timing and the length of the precipitation really matters. Let's see, what else do we have here? I think that's slide through elevated was the shoreline of Egypt. Yes. Okay, so there was a comment about landslides also in Vermont, and they do have some similar clay landslides that were part of glacial Lake Winooski. Yep. So they have very similar landslides to what we have in southern Maine, and those are around the Burlington area. All right. So if I didn't answer anyone's questions adequately, feel free to ask for clarification.
Yeah, just a reminder, if you have a question, you can just type it in the chat box for Lindsay.
And again, I apologize about the disruption about my phone. Nobody calls me ever on my home phone. And of course that happens when I'm giving a presentation. Just goes to show you. I can't even remember the last time it rang. I was quite surprised.
No worries.
Well, it looks like I don't see any other questions.
Okay. I told you everything, right? So yeah, we have a lot of free resources, and you can feel free to contact me directly if you think of anything later, or if you want guidance towards more information. If you live in a coastal area, I have two coworkers who are coastal geologists, Steve Dixon and Pete Slavinsky, and they've been working on these areas for a really, really long time. And so I could also put you in contact with them about coastal landslide questions. They've seen it all. Okay.
Lindsay, is your email accessible on the website, or do you want to put it in the chat box, or how can people contact you?
I can type it in the chat box. It's just my first name and my last name at maine.gov.